January 4th, 1971. Dubrow's Furniture Store, South Philadelphia. 8 men walk in. The store owner had refused to pay protection money to the organization running the neighborhood's rackets. This is the response. A janitor is shot dead. An employee is doused in gasoline and set on fire. 13 other clerks are bound and beaten. 2 more are shot and wounded. Then the men set additional fires, specifically to destroy evidence before they disappear back into the city. Philadelphia's own police commissioner, Frank Rizzo, would later call it the most vicious crime I have ever come across. A real, on-record statement from a man who'd seen plenty of Philadelphia's worst. The raid itself became a turning point in how Philadelphia law enforcement approached organized crime investigations moving forward. The scale and brutality of what happened at Dubrow's, combined with the broader 40-plus murders eventually tied to the organization, pushed city and federal investigators toward treating the Black Mafia with the same dedicated task force resources that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for pursuing Italian-American organized crime, a shift in law enforcement priority that took a body count this severe to force into place. The man who led that raid would spend the rest of his life in prison for it. And inside that prison, he would become so powerful and so dangerous that 2 separate state governments eventually arranged to trade him like an asset, sending him to Minnesota in direct exchange for that state's most dangerous inmate. His name was Robert Nudie Mims. This is his real, documented story. Philadelphia's Black Mafia formed in the late 1960s under a man named Samuel Christian, a former Black Panther known for a commanding physical presence and an extensive arrest record. Christian built the organization deliberately separate from Philadelphia's existing Italian mafia, its own territory, its own rackets, its own internal structure. Christian himself cut an imposing figure that matched the organization's reputation. Contemporaneous descriptions put him at 5'10" and roughly 215 pounds, described by those who knew him as thick-necked and powerfully built. He'd come up through the Black Panther Party before founding the Black Mafia, carrying an extensive arrest record with him into the new organization from the very start. Robert Mims was one of the organization's founding members, alongside men who'd go on to become notorious in their own right: Ronald Harvey, Robert "Bop" Daddy Fairbanks, and several others. Over the years, the organization operated from roughly 1969 through the mid-1980s. It was tied to more than 40 murders, alongside extensive drug trafficking, extortion, and prostitution operations across North and South Philadelphia. Unlike the Italian-American Mafia in the same city, which by this period had deep, documented ties to organized labor unions, the Black Mafia built its revenue almost entirely from direct street-level rackets, extorting bookmakers and brothel operators, running numbers across entire neighborhoods, and controlling drug distribution block by block. It was a different model of organized crime, built more on direct territorial control and enforced fear than on the kind of institutional infiltration the Italian Mafia had spent decades building elsewhere in the city. A significant number of the organization's members converted to the Nation of Islam over this period, enough that the group picked up an informal second name on the street: the Muslim Mafia. The organization's territorial boundaries were specific and, for a time, respected on both sides. Philadelphia's Black Mafia and the existing Italian-American Mafia effectively split South Philadelphia along Broad Street, each running their own rackets on their own side of that line. That arrangement held until members of the Black Mafia crossed Broad Street and began extorting white numbers runners operating in Italian-controlled territory, a direct violation of the informal boundary that nearly triggered open war between the two organizations before police intervened and diffused the situation. Robert Mims himself would later be known by a second name as well, Amin Jabbar, reflecting that same religious conversion, a detail that becomes genuinely important later in his story, not just a footnote. Other founding members of the organization had their own separate, equally violent histories running in parallel to Mims's. Ronald Harvey, one of the group's co-founders, was connected to a 1973 attack hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, a break-in at the Washington, D.C. townhouse of basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, targeting a resident there who had publicly denounced a prominent Muslim leader as a false prophet. That the Black Mafia's reach and violence extended into a case involving one of the most famous athletes in the country in a city far from their own territory says something about the scale the organization operated at during this period. Mims's story was one thread in a much larger, more violent fabric. The Dubrow Furniture Store raid wasn't a random act of violence. It was a business decision in the coldest possible sense. The store owner had declined to pay the protection payments the Black Mafia demanded from businesses operating in their territory, and the raid was the organization's answer. Frank Rizzo himself is worth a brief note here, since his name carries real weight in Philadelphia history beyond this one case. He was already one of the most well-known and controversial police commissioners in the country by 1971, known for an aggressive, hardline reputation that would carry him into 2 terms as the city's mayor a few years later. A man with that specific career, who'd personally overseen the response to years of the city's worst violence, singling out Dubrow's as the single worst crime he'd ever encountered, is a genuinely significant marker of how far outside the norm this specific act was considered, even by Philadelphia's own standards. Court records and contemporaneous reporting describe the specific brutality of what happened inside the store that day in granular detail. Employees bound, beaten, one man doused in gasoline and set alight, a janitor killed. The fires set afterward weren't incidental. They were a deliberate attempt to destroy physical evidence before police could process the scene. Robert Mims was convicted for his role in the raid and sentenced to life without parole. He was still a young man. Whatever life he might have imagined for himself outside prison walls ended with that sentence. Getting that conviction at all required overcoming an obstacle that protected the Black Mafia for years before and after the Dubrow's raid. According to researchers who've studied the organization's history, witnesses in Black Mafia cases rarely cooperated with prosecutors out of a documented, well-founded fear of retaliation, a pattern that let the organization's untouchable reputation on the street continue to grow even as arrests occasionally happened. The Dubrow's case was severe and public enough, with enough surviving victims willing to testify despite that fear, that prosecutors were able to secure the conviction that put Mims away for good. What happened next is the part of his story that almost never gets told alongside the crime itself. Inside Graterford Prison, Pennsylvania's largest state correctional facility, Robert Mims didn't simply serve his sentence quietly. He became, according to multiple independent accounts, the undisputed leader of the facility's Black inmate population, a position built on a combination of personal force of character and his role as an imam within the prison's Nation of Islam community. That combination of criminal reputation and genuine religious leadership inside the prison system is worth sitting with directly, because it's not a contradiction this story is going to smooth over. Mims was simultaneously a man serving life for one of the most brutal crimes in Philadelphia's recent history, and a man other incarcerated men looked to for spiritual guidance. His influence extended well past prison walls. In May 1980, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court granted him a retrial, which briefly put him back on the street. During that window, a photograph was taken of him alongside fellow Black Mafia figure Shamsuddin Ali, flanking Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete in the world at that time. That photograph is real, documented, and still circulated by researchers studying this exact period of Philadelphia history. It's not a rumor or an internet legend. It's a genuine image of one of the most recognizable men on the planet, standing next to a convicted murderer who was, for a brief window, out on retrial. The other man in that photograph, Shamsuddin Ali, had his own documented history that ran parallel to Mims's in almost every respect. Born Clarence Fowler, he served time in Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison for a murder conviction in the early 1970s before that conviction was overturned. Like Mims, Ali became an influential figure inside the prison system itself. And like Mims, his story didn't end there. Decades later, in 2005, he drew national attention when he was convicted on racketeering charges as part of a major federal corruption investigation in Philadelphia that had originally begun as a drug case. Two men in one photograph, standing beside a boxing legend, both of them serving as living proof of exactly how deep this organization's influence ran on both sides of the prison walls across multiple decades. What happened after that brief taste of freedom, and exactly how dangerous Robert Mims became once he went back behind bars, is the part of this story that gets genuinely hard to believe, even though every detail of it is documented. Stay with me. And if this is the kind of real history you want more of, verified, not just repeated, subscribe. That's the whole channel. Now, what happened when the retrial went wrong? Mims's freedom didn't last. He was rearrested after police executed a search warrant on his apartment and found cocaine, a Thompson machine gun, and an Israeli-made Uzi submachine gun, along with drug-cutting equipment. The full inventory investigators recovered from that apartment paints a specific picture of exactly what kind of operation Mims was still running, even during his brief window of freedom. Beyond the weapons themselves, police found strainers and scales, standard equipment for cutting and packaging narcotics for street-level distribution, not the tools of a man who'd stepped away from the drug trade during his time out on retrial. He went back to prison and back into the operation he'd never actually stopped running. From inside Graterford, Mims continued to be involved in major heroin deals across the Philadelphia area, working directly with both his own Black Mafia associates and Italian-American organized crime figures on the outside, an incarcerated man still functioning as an active player in the city's drug trade. His influence and danger level inside Pennsylvania's prison system eventually became significant enough that authorities made an almost unbelievable decision. They traded him. Robert Mims was transferred out of the Pennsylvania system and into Minnesota's in a direct exchange for that state's most dangerous inmate, a prisoner swap between two separate state governments built around the specific threat one incarcerated man represented to the institution holding him. That's not a figure of speech. That's a documented account from researchers who've studied Pennsylvania's prison history in this exact period of an actual inmate exchange between two states built specifically around Robert Mims. The Dubrow's case itself never fully faded from public memory the way many decades-old crimes eventually do. It resurfaced on national television in 2007, discussed as part of a BET documentary special on the Philadelphia Black Mafia, revisiting the raid and its brutality for a new generation of viewers decades after it happened. A real, documented sign that this specific case retained enough historical weight to warrant a fresh look, long after most of the men involved were already dead or still serving out their sentences. The organization's history eventually became the subject of serious academic study. Sean Patrick Griffin, a professor specializing in the administration of justice, spent years researching the Black Mafia's rise and fall before publishing a full-length book on its history, treating an organization most true crime coverage had reduced to a handful of violent headlines as a subject worthy of the same serious historical documentation given to the Italian Mafia and other far more widely covered criminal organizations. That kind of sustained scholarly attention doesn't happen to crime stories nobody considers significant. The broader Black Mafia organization didn't survive much longer after Mims' transfer out of the Pennsylvania system. Leadership passed to Eugene "Bo" Baines, following founder Sam Christian's own later arrest, until Baines was convicted and imprisoned on a separate narcotics case in 1974. Christian himself was eventually paroled in 1988, only to be arrested again for crack cocaine possession in 1990, while reportedly advising a successor organization, the Junior Black Mafia. By the time law enforcement pressure and years of internal conflict had run their course, the organization Mims helped found in the late 1960s had been effectively dismantled, with its founder eventually dying in 2016 without a single headline marking his passing. That's worth sitting with as its own kind of ending, distinct from Mims's own. Sam Christian built an organization responsible for over 40 murders and years of terror across 2 Philadelphia neighborhoods, and by the time he died decades later, having outlived Mims by 4 years, there wasn't a single news outlet that thought his death was worth reporting. The organization's founder disappeared from public memory almost entirely, while Mims, through the sheer documented scale of the Dubrow's case and his prison system notoriety, remained the name that survived. Robert Nudie Mims died in a Minnesota prison in 2012 at 69 years old, having spent over 4 decades in custody for a crime committed in 1971. So here's the actual shape of this story. A founding member of one of the most violent criminal organizations in Philadelphia's history, responsible for a crime so brutal the city's own police commissioner called it the worst he'd ever encountered. A man who never should have set foot outside a cell again after that conviction, and who nonetheless became powerful enough inside those cell walls to keep running a drug operation, to be photographed next to Muhammad Ali during a brief release, and to become so dangerous to the institution holding him that 2 states literally traded him like a piece of property. That's not a redemption story. Robert Mims never stopped being exactly what the Dubrow's raid proved him to be. What makes his story worth telling isn't a change of heart, it's the sheer, documented scale of what one man managed to build and control, from inside a cell for over 4 decades, until the day he died still in custody. Compare his path to the other men connected to his story, and the specific shape of it becomes even clearer. Sam Christian, the founder, walked free eventually and died in obscurity. Shamsuddin Ali served time, had a conviction overturned, and lived long enough to face an entirely separate federal case decades later. Mims never walked free again after 1971. His entire remaining influence, every documented achievement, and every documented crime that followed happened from inside institutions that were specifically built to contain men exactly like him. And by every available account, they largely failed to. If you want more real Philadelphia history, the organizations most people have never heard of, the rest of the channel is right there.